Hello. Um, so today I want to make a brief video about a very controversial subject, which was atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. In fact, the events which brought an immediate end to World War II. I want to just voice a few thoughts on this briefly because we're coming up now to the 70th anniversary, I believe, later this week. Um, Basically, these are very famous events, but if you don't know what happened, the United States Air Force dropped two atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Well over 150,000 people were killed in both cities, and many more were burned. Atomic warfare at this stage was still in its infancy. These were terrifying, and up until this point, untested weapons in an active war. This was the first and so far only major example of atomic warfare. Um, and the sort of weapons that were developed later on in the Cold War were even more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I believe the single largest weapon ever detonated was the Tsar Bomba by the Soviet Union in 1961. So I don't need to give a lecture on the history of nuclear arms. Um, I just want to voice my reflections on this because it's a very contentious issue, and I believe that people don't always look at all aspects of this, or at least a lot of people tend to have a very reactionary attitude, which is understandable, but at the same time, it doesn't look at the whole picture. Um, a lot of people take the view that what happened was just pure evil and there's no justification for it. But there's others that contend that this was a necessary evil. Now, I sway towards the latter line of thinking based on what I know about this event. Um, you have to look at the context of the time. Japan was a very, very, very determined power. Imperial Japan was absolutely hell-bent on the utter subjugation of the rest of Asia. Um, to this day, Japanese war crimes remain a deeply controversial issue in countries like, especially in China, but also in the Philippines, in the Korean Peninsula, in many other parts of Asia. To this day, it's a controversial issue. Um, And there's still senior Japanese politicians who deny, for example, the existence of comfort women during World War II. Um, I think that when a country refuses to look at its past completely, then that I find a lot of the problem with East Asia today is that it's still very much governed by nationalism, and part of that nationalism is an absolute refusal to recognize one's own past. Now, Japan has kind of went halfway on this, but then every time it kind of makes progress, it retracts. I say, I think Japan, and I've spoken to Japanese people about this, and I'm not talking about online, I mean face to face. I get the impression Japan has something of an identity crisis. On one hand, there's many Japanese who have this very contrite attitude of shame and sort of guilt, collective guilt about what Imperial Japan done during the war. In case I need to remind anyone, we're talking about whole-scale civilian massacres, forced slavery, um, deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, brutal torture. The list goes on and on and on. Some of the worst crimes of the 20th century were committed by Imperial Japan. That doesn't mean that other countries weren't guilty of doing terrible things. My country done some terrible things during the days of empire. Um, Germany certainly done terrible things; those are well documented. But the attitudes in Germany and Japan are a bit different. Germany doesn't. There's no sort of. I think the sense in Germany is it's sort of accepted. In Japan, it's accepted to an extent, but then you get a lot of nationalistic politicians who refuse to fully recognise this, and especially at this time, this is becoming a hot topic. Anyway, the reason I'm mentioning that is you need to understand that context in any debate about the A bombs. Um, the first thing is the notion that if you believe something was justified, I really want to emphasize this point. Just because you believe that something is justified doesn't mean you take any sort of contentment in it. It doesn't mean that you think it's a good thing in itself. I've seen the pictures of burns victims from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Incidentally, Hiroshima was going to be another city that was hit, but because of fog, Hiroshima was the target. That's still a very poignant reminder today. You could still see that temple. I haven't been to Japan, but I've seen photographs of that. So I'm under no illusions about the sheer terror and the mass fatalities that that caused, and the agonizing pain that survivors went through. I'm under no illusions about that. But you have to weigh this up against how many more people would have died had World War II been protracted. This was a war that had already cost anywhere from 55 to 70 million lives. Even the lower figures are, you know, tens of millions of lives had been lost. The Pacific Theater was one of the most intense theaters. So, from a practical point of view, you have to consider how many more would have died. I I see the A bombs as a utilitarian question. That is the deaths of 150,000 people, 200,000. I can't recall the exact figure. It was a lot of people. But weigh that up against the millions more that would have died. Bearing in mind it was Japanese troops still in the jungles in the 1970s believing that the war was ongoing. This was a very almost cult-like mentality. Either we win or we die. Um, that Japan had during World War II. And even Japanese politicians, there's two camps, of course, it's the nationalists, but there's been other Japanese politicians who even themselves have said that they conceded that there was no other option for ending the war than the A bombs. But the difficulty is anybody who says that it's justified are seen as sadistic people who don't care about the suffering. I mean, innocent Japanese people died. There's no question about that. And I'm sure many, many of those people had absolutely no choice about whether they supported the emperor or not. In fact, they would have had no choice. This is the tragedy of total war. But when we analyze this, we have to remember this was a total war. This wasn't like wars today where there are more choices available. In a total war, the choices are limited. And no one can dispute that, whatever you think of the A bombs, no one can dispute the fact that World War II was brought to an immediate end afterwards. Um, this was a fact. Large scale fighting immediately ended after that. There were a few civil wars that sprung out of the aftermath of World War II, but as for the war itself, it immediately ended. Now, can anyone dispute that? I I do think that some of those who rushed to the judgment that what the United States done was terrible, without looking at the context, nothing wrong with thinking that what they done was terrible because it was terrible. There's no way to ever glorify this. But I think people who say it's just outright wrong and then ignore not only Japanese war crimes, many war crimes, people seem to have amnesia about what Japan done. Um, and I don't think you'll find very many people in China or the Philippines or any of the other country that suffered under imperialist Japan um, trying to argue that the A bombs were not necessary. It was a terrible thing. Whenever innocent people die, it's terrible. But this was a war that had already cost millions of lives. I'm not saying that the lives lost at Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't significant. They were. But when there's so much focus on this event, sometimes I think it overshadows, frankly, the bigger picture. Um, of course, Truman and America has been denounced ever since because of this. But I would say to those people, if you were in President Truman's shoes, and your job as president of a major allied country, not the only allied country, incidentally, but a major allied country with nuclear capabilities. The decision that Truman made was possibly the most difficult decision any president in American history has ever had to make. Possibly, arguably, the most difficult decision any world leader has ever had to make. Now, Truman should never be glorified for that decision, but I think those who demonize him need to really consider what options there were. The idea that Japan could have just negotiated that is incredibly naive. Looking at the sort of power that Japan was at that time, the concept of surrender would have been unthinkable for Japan with any other sort of conventional warfare. I mean, bear in mind there had been ferocious battles fought on the Pacific front, the Battle of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, etc., etc. Those battles, in many cases, had cost more lives than the A bombs. So my point is, Japan was willing to take massive sacrifice at all prices in order to continue the war. But it was this terrible weapon that brought an instant end to the war. Now, can anyone deny that? I've looked at a lot of debates on this, and I've looked at a lot of the arguments put against it. And there's a lot of people saying things like the Japanese army was in disarray. There was moderate factions of the Japanese government that wanted to talk to the Americans. Um, I guess there could be an argument with that, but they weren't in power. It's Hirohito and General Tojo who were in power. So, all I'm saying is that yes, it was a terrible event, but you have to look at the bigger picture. You have to, and that's not being an apologist for it. I don't like that term because when people say, "Oh, you're being an apologist," it kind of indicates that you think it is a good thing. Not a good thing. It's a terrible thing. But I do believe it was the lesser of two evils. The greater evil would have been allowing the war to continue, and those who say it was wrong no matter what, I would say, well, wait a second. Are you therefore, by extension, you're saying that Truman and the other Allied leaders should have just let the war continue? I've seen no evidence, I've seen no compelling argument suggesting that the Japanese government was going to surrender before the A bombs. And if I do see an argument like that, I might change my stance on this. Actually, my position at the moment is changed from, before I had that opinion that a lot of people have. Oh, it's terrible. These evil Americans done this, and I mean, I've heard stories, for example, about the pilots that dropped the bombs having a nervous breakdown afterwards from guilt. I'm not surprised. And I would never ever condone, for example, glorification of what happened because a lot of civilians died. And, the consequences were frightening. Of course, this has also fueled the arguments against nuclear warfare, understandably, atomic then nuclear warfare. But I really, really think that people need to look at everything with this. And by saying that I believe it was the lesser of two evils is in no way saying I think it was a good thing in itself. But I do think it's a bit hypocritical for people to condemn the A bombs and then completely forget the millions that Imperial Japan had killed, enslaved, and tortured. I mean, not just what they'd done to Allied troops, the brutal torture, forced labor, and so on, but the millions of civilians they had killed. I mean, this was a ferocious, sadistic power, and I don't care if it's politically incorrect now to say that. People say that well, history's written by the winners. That is true, but the revisionist notion, oh, Japan done nothing wrong, and Japan was just trying to free Asia from the colonialist Westerners. That is complete. It's completely perverse distortion of history, and it is an insult to the millions who suffered under Imperial Japan. Some of whom are still alive. People who survived POW camps, civilians who survived, but still to this day are haunted by what happened. Now, I've always and this is still topical because Japan today is obviously going through a debate about what its constitution should be. And a lot of people, Shinzo Abe is becoming incredibly unpopular and controversial, although not among nationalists. They probably see him as a hero, but many Japanese see him as reckless. Um, so the Japanese people, I have a lot of respect for because I think today most Japanese people do have a recognition that what their country done in World War II was unforgivable. I do think there is a recognition of that. Um, by the way, people are going to no doubt say, "Oh, what did your country do in World War II, etc." The truth is, World War II was a total war. No country was completely innocent. I mean, my country, we firebombed Dresden. That was a terrible event, and there was no military strategy whatsoever for that. But Germany had also killed thousands upon thousands of British civilians in our cities. So what people need to remember about World War II, it was a total war. Every country suffered, some more than others, but every country suffered. And I think it's all very well in today's world, where we actually have fewer conflicts than ever before in history. In this context, to say, "Oh, it was terrible what happened, it's pure wrong, and that's it," without looking at the context. That's all I'm saying. Context is everything. Now, if I see compelling evidence that there was a realistic chance that the Japanese government were going to surrender, then we can maybe argue the A bombs were not necessary. But I've looked at both sides of this debate. I've thought about it carefully, and my position at the moment is that this was a necessary evil. It can never ever be called a good thing, but you have to look at the implications of what happened afterwards. World War II ended. Deadliest conflict in human history was brought to a sudden end. No one can dispute that.